there's more than one way to do it, but go ahead and do it. Make your change if you have to. That's basically what I get from the song Grooving On.
There's a lot of ways of grooving on. There are many ways to be strong. There's a light for me to share the way. The only way I know to live another day, to be classified in the precious sun. From me to you, oh, yeah, yeah, father to son, mother to daughter, yeah, everyone on an ending note. I've just begun, 'cause I'm hoping and dreaming to face a brand new day, and I'm longing, believing that we can find our way. There are many ways to open our mind. Times we show we can find a sense of direction from the truth we share. Clear away this dismal glare. There's a lot of ways of grooving on. Many things, whoa, yeah, they can go wrong. These times, whoa, these times, do you mind? I care. So many ways to share the feel. 'Cause I'm hoping and dreaming, face a brand new day, and I'm longing, believing that we can find our way. Oh yes, I'm hoping, dreaming, face a brand new day, and I am longing, longing, believing that we can find our way. Oh yeah. Whoa, 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 yeah. Hey. Wait for me, baby. Wait for my life. Wait for the pleasure.
Yeah.
And what, so let's, you want to do it again?
Yeah.
From there.
And you make me smile. And
Yeah, I need a little more acoustic guitar.
Doesn't Paul do the flute in it?
Yeah, Paul does flute.
Nice.
Every time.
Open invitation.
Oh, that's oh, yeah. That's like a
I guess it says what it is. It's like sending a gift card out there going, hey, I'm free, I'm single, I'm free, come get me. Just, it's something like that.
So I guess you were single when you were.
Yeah, okay, we'll go with it.
He's never single.
Someday I'm gonna find you. I wish upon a star. I don't know what you look like, but I know what you're like. Don't know who you are. You got an open invitation. You want me, an open reservation. Looking through my window, feeling passing by.
Good morning, everyone. Let the record show that we have a quorum, and I'm calling this public inquiry into the Auditor General's report on customs in the Cayman Islands, May 2019, at 10:12. First order of business is swearing of the witnesses, so let me take care of that.
Okay.
I can't jump.
Okay. Yes, sir. Really? Okay. Mr. Chairman, good morning. I, Kenneth Jefferson, hereby swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this Honorable Legislative Assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Which one am I doing? Okay.
Michael, WPTQ Nixon.
I, Michael Nixon, swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this Honorable Legislative Assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And again, I ask the members to forgive me. My mother would spank me because I haven't told you all good morning, and thank you all for coming. So at this time, we'll invite the Auditor General to make her opening remarks on the Customs in the Cayman Islands report, May 2019.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Public Accounts Committee, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to make some opening remarks. The report we are considering today is Customs in the Cayman Islands that my office published in June 2019. This performance audit assesses how efficient and effective Customs was at collecting revenue and protecting the border. Our audit focused on three main areas: strategic and business planning, revenue collection, and border protection. As the first witness relates to revenues, I'll start with revenue collection, as Customs is a significant government revenue source, around 165 million a year. And it's disappointing that 4 years after my office reported on collecting government revenues, we looked again at this significant area of revenue generation and find that minimal progress has been made in processing and managing revenue waivers and concessions. There's still no policy in place for awarding them, and an unknown amount of revenue is being lost as waivers and concession approvals are not being tracked or monitored, which, in addition to creating an unquantifiable tax gap, also means that it is unknown if the benefits expected as a consequence of awarding these concessions are being delivered or not. Budget setting also needs to improve, as government is consistently collecting more revenue than is budgeted for. Customs did not have a strategic plan, a workforce plan, nor performance management information in place to manage their business effectively. But we do now see some building blocks in place, and the relatively recent creation of the new Customs and Border Control Department is a positive development, creating a holistic approach to the dual functions of revenue collection and border control. And it now extends across all three islands. We see this new entity starting to change its approach to both managing its business and protecting the jurisdiction's borders, but with more needing to be done over time on better using intelligence to inform risk management. Finally, phase one of the implementation of the IT system to modernise customs was not well managed, being both late with significant cost overruns and having considerable sums ultimately written off. We hope these problems will be avoided with the next phase. Government has accepted the 15 recommendations set out in Appendix 2 and plans to implement these between 2019 and 2022. Thank you very much, Chairman. I have with me today Mr. Kwame Alfrani, who undertook the audit, along with the Director and Manager of Performance Audit, Angela Cullen and Julius Aurelio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, AG, for the opening remarks. And I think, Mr. Austin, you will lead the first question. As usual, Mr. Jefferson, you're here with us all the time, so you know the routine. When you're asked the first question, you just identify yourself by name and title, and the same goes for Mr. Nixon. But thank you both for coming. We appreciate the effort you must make at this time, because we know that there's a little thing that underfoot that begins with D and ends with T that is occupying quite a bit of time. Ms. Austin.
Mr. Chairman, before we proceed, I would humbly like to recuse myself from this session with Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Nixon, as I am the Councillor for the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Austin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, certainly I want to echo your sentiments by saying good morning to my colleagues on the Public Accounts Committee on both sides of the aisle, the Auditor General's Office and the Accountant General, and likewise to our two witnesses who have appeared to answer questions of this committee. I only have one or two questions. I will ask the witnesses to turn to page 32 in the Auditor General's report, Customs in the Cayman Islands, May 2019, and draw your attention to paragraph 82, which, for the convenience of our witnesses and those listening in, I will read. Paragraph 82, page 32 says, some concessions are awarded with related conditions such as the creation of jobs. However, these are not monitored. The government, therefore, does not know whether businesses are delivering the conditions that are specified as a requirement of concessions being granted. As the government is regularly and repeatedly held to account for the promised job creations that come when we engage in whether it be public and private partnerships or whether we give concessions to new businesses, business ventures, hotels, and the like, we are oftentimes asked, where are those promised new jobs that our Caymanians would otherwise occupy? Therefore, my question to the witnesses is, can they advise this committee what actions have been taken that both approve, well, first of all, that confirm that approved concessions are validated, but also that those validated concessions and the commitments made by the respective companies are both monitored and reported on a regular basis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Harris, and good morning, Mr. Chairman, and all honourable members of the committee, and the Auditor General and her staff from the Audit Office. Mr. Chairman, before I actually attempt to answer that question directly, I just wanted to make some preliminary remarks in general, and I won't be long. I want to say, sir, that the importance of customs to the government is acknowledged. It's quite significant when 20 to 25% of government's annual revenue comes from the customs import duty. So it's very significant, and therefore it is very important that we have a good forecast of those numbers. Principally because our expenditure level that we set is based on the revenues that we collect. And I would make the observation that the Auditor General makes in the report that there are variances. The variances, I think stated in her report, are around, I think 7 to 10% was the number quoted. And from the time period that she looked at, the variances in dollar terms were between 10 million and 23 million variance. I should very quickly say that trend has continued into 2018, because the Auditor General's report stopped at December 17. So in 2018, quickly for the committee's benefit, the total amount of import duty collected on various sources, motor vehicle duty, gasoline, alcoholic beverages, etc., and the big category of other import duty, for the year 2018, that amounted to 156 million. That was the budget, that was the budgeted number. The actual revenue number was 181 million. And so expressing one as a percentage of the other, when we also take into account that the revenue for the government, the total revenue for the year 2018 was approximately 838 million. The actual import duty revenue of 181 would represent 22%. So it's directly in the ballpark that the Auditor General is speaking to, of 20 to 25%. So that trend continues in 2018. In terms of a variance, Mr. Chairman, the 156 million budget versus the 181 million in actual revenues obviously gives us a variance of around 16%, which is even higher than the range quoted in the Auditor General's report. So those are just some facts, Mr. Chairman, that validates the Auditor General's comments in her report. Just very quickly as well, to obviously say that we don't expect that variances will be zero at all times. We don't expect actual revenues to equal budgeted revenues, but we do expect that there will be some variances. Mr. Chairman, customs obviously now falls under the Ministry of Employment and Border Control, and that was effective the 1st of February 2019. Mr. Chairman, directly to Member Harris's questions, this has been, quite frankly, a problematic area for the government to monitor. The honest answer is that in the Ministry of Finance itself, I do not believe that we have ever undertaken going out onto work sites and to question contractors and to obtain evidence of the number of Caymanians on the site, which I think is quite frequently on the large concessions is a condition of the concession being granted, that sometimes it's as general as many Caymanians as possible. It would be a stipulation, a condition of the concession. Simply, sir, and committee members, the Minister of Finance, I think we don't have the resources to go out and do job site visits. And I think if you were to press the elected government a bit closer, the answer would be, well, certainly with the reworked work agency, it is hoped and is believed that because of the new enhanced systems that they may put in place, they should be able to get a better idea as to whether that particular concession, condition of the concession is being adhered to. Mr. Chairman, if I missed anything from Member Harris's question, he could let me know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that response. Mr. Chairman, the witness talks through you about not having the resources to conduct on-site, job site visits, but I am aware of other requirements of other companies operating in the Cayman Islands being asked to provide via email on a monthly basis a report either to the Department of Labor and Pensions, either to work or other ministries, simply stipulating the breakdown in staff at various development sites, breakdown between foreign professionals, skilled and unskilled, Caymanians or otherwise. And certainly this is something that can be achieved vis-a-vis digital communication, and certainly thereafter, if any irregularities are noted, then perhaps it might warrant a site visit. But surely to say to this committee that we don't have the resources to do job site visits, and that is the reason why we cannot monitor whether companies have delivered on concessions, I think, respectfully, is a bit of a cop-out. I wonder, my question is, Mr. Chairman, certainly, has the ministry explored this sort of communication and requiring firms who are given concessions by the government to provide monthly or quarterly reports that then can be scrutinized by Ministry of Finance and other government ministries to ensure that concessions granted are in fact being followed through on, without the need and the initial sense of making site visits, unless there are issues that warrant those visits?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I wish to reassure Member Harris that it's certainly, my answer certainly wasn't meant to be a cop-out. It was an honest answer. But what he suggests, certainly, sir, is quite possible. It's simply the case that myself and Mr. Nixon are not aware. We can't say it's happening or it's not happening. We're not aware of information being essentially returned electronically back to what was the NWDA or now the work. It may be happening. If it's happening, then great. But we're not getting, in the Ministry of Finance, we're not getting feedback that it is happening. It may be happening. That's the best answer I can give, sir.
Mr. Jefferson, maybe you could shed some light for us and the listening public. Can you take us through the process of granting concessions and whether the concessions are granted on a contractual agreement which has quantities based on the concession, or whether this is just some kind of laissez-faire agreement that is announced in public, and customs is then expected to take the developer's word that this piece of pipe is for that concession and not for his cousin's house. Can you take us through the process of how these concessions are granted? What are the normal conditions that are attached to these concessions, if there are any, and whether government has an overarching policy on how the concessions are granted, or whether it's usually a individual negotiation with each developer or whomever is seeking concessions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, definitely there is no final approved concession policy as of this morning. There is a draft one, and I'm sure we're going to get questioned a bit more on that later on. There is a draft one, a draft concession policy, which was presented to caucus as recently as Monday of this week, but it's not in final form. Mr. Chairman, the most problematic concessions for the government to monitor are typically those involving requests for waivers of import duty. In simple terms, the cabinet is only enabled to grant a concession if it's in accordance with the law. So typically, what was the customs law before, which has now become the Customs and Border Control law, I believe, grants the cabinet an ability. So it has a legal ability to grant waivers, concession, abatements of import duty of any magnitude. The cabinet has delegated $20,000 of that unlimited amount to the Minister for Finance in his discretion that he can waive. But obviously a significant project is going to be far in excess of $20,000. So the Minister for Finance cannot individually agree on it and cannot waive it. Typically what happens, Mr. Chairman and members, is that a contractor, a developer, would write into the Ministry of Finance seeking a concession. And it would detail, obviously, what the development was all about, be it a luxury condo development, be it a small hotel. It would write in making the request for an import duty waiver. That is going to result, Mr. Chairman, in a cabinet, because it's going to be always going to be more than $20,000. The Minister for Finance would take the paper to cabinet, and in the paper we would obviously set out what the request is, what the likely dollar impact will be on government's revenue if the concession were granted. The paper would detail what sensible conditions that cabinet should attach to the approval of that concession, and that is then all documented in the form at the very end of a cabinet extract that makes the decision whether to grant the waiver abatement or not, with any conditions attached to it. And typically those conditions can be that it is for a certain monetary limit as to how much the value of the concession can be in its maximum form. Recently, it typically has an expiry date as to when the concession is valid until, and also the conditions typically now about the employment of Caymanians as far as possible. I think, Mr. Chairman, those are the main points. So a developer contractor would write in typically to the Minister for Finance, and the Minister of Finance would produce a cabinet paper to cabinet.
And how is that decision communicated to customs, and what authority is presented to the requesting body to show the customs that he's entitled to customs duty? And is there sufficient detail in that grant to allow customs to monitor it and say, well, yeah, these 15 windows is okay, but these 5, this is not the kind of windows you put in a hotel. These are all bathroom windows, so you can't have that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to give Mr. Michael Nixon an opportunity to assist the committee with this. I mean, I can do so, but I want to give him an opportunity.
Sure.
Just very briefly, Mr. Nixon is in charge of the corporate unit within the Ministry of Finance that typically deals and processes these applications for concessions. So I'm going to ask Mr. Nixon if he can address what you just posed.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, further to what Mr. Jefferson just described, whenever a concession is granted, a letter is issued to the individual or the entity that's been awarded the concession, and we are very specific in those letters as to what items are to be included and not are to be included in the concession, and highlight things that are specifically excluded. That letter is also provided to the Customs and Border Control Department. If in the processing of the concessions as imports come through, there's any gray area, we have an excellent working relationship with the Customs Department, and those issues are highlighted to us and clarified, and any clarification instructions that need to be issued are issued from the Ministry to Customs and also to the entity.
Does that letter contain quantities of individual items, or is it just a dollar value? And it may say building material, furniture, chattels, or does it relate to a mill list for the building?
It does not always include a specific bill of quantities because of the nature of most of the developments. Where we can obtain a specific bill of quantities, we do. And in recent circumstances, within the last year in particular, we have put particular emphasis on having the contractor, the developer, obtain specific approval from the ministry prior to that approval being granted to customs to clear the particular goods. So where they can produce the bill of quantities, obviously that's the preferred approach, but that's not always possible on the developer's part until, unfortunately, the goods are being imported. So to your point, Mr. Chairman, and use an example, sometimes they may propose at the beginning that they're going to bring in, let's say, 50 windows of a certain spec, and then when it comes down to it, that number has either increased or decreased, and so accordingly, the concession needs to be amended to allow for that change.
Yeah.
So, just to clarify, when I use that example in terms, that would be for the specific goods to be imported. What is not changed is the dollar amount of the concession. So it's not that the concession would be increased in terms of, let's say it was $1 million up to $1 million of import duty waived. That amount would not be increased, but it may be how it's applied to specific items that are to be imported under that concession.
Mr. Chairman, through you, how does the process that you just described, how does that tie in with the hotel aids bill? I mean the hotel aids law.
Mr. Chairman, thank to Member Bush for that question. I'm advised that we in the Ministry of Finance have never worked with that particular law in granting a concession. We never referenced that law in granting a concession.
We will accept that the Minister of Finance, under the Customs and New Border Control legislation, has bespoke provisions to grant concessions, right? But when we have bespoke legislation, such as the Hotel Aids Law, which specifically defines what can be granted to hotels. For instance, the law says that any hotel being built between along the 7 Mile Beach corridor can't be given any concessions at all. And hotels being built in other parts of the islands can get, I think it is, the Judah rate is fixed at 2%. Has the Minister of Finance obtained legal opinion that the authority given to the Minister of Finance or even to Cabinet has the specific authority to override that bespoke legislation?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm not aware that the Minister for Finance has obtained that legal position. I'm not aware that he has. I'm not aware as to whether he's asked for it. And if he has asked, I don't know what the answer is. It does, Mr. Chairman and committee members, it obviously presents a legal challenge, because if, on the one hand, if you do have the Hotel Aids Law that specifies certain positions, in contrast, then you have the Customs and Border Control Law, which then gives the Cabinet general ability to waive any amounts in unlimited fashion. That sort of presents a dilemma, and that can best be resolved by making a legal change to one or the other. Is the best way I can answer that question, sir.
Yeah, but because I'm not a lawyer and I wouldn't recommend that you take my legal advice, but I don't think it is possible for government policy based on some general caveat in one law to override the specific provisions that exist in bespoke legislation for that specific purpose. Because the other thing that in the regulation for the Hotel Aids Law, the format by which one applies for concessions, specifically on hotels, is very deliberate and very specific. And hotel purposes is defined in the law to say the provision of accommodations for guests for reward. And B, the provision of supplies, services, amenities, and facilities for cultural and recreational pursuits, primarily for consumption by or the enjoyment or use of guests accommodated for reward at the hotel in relation to which the expression is being used, or C, any purpose directly ancillary to the purpose specified in paragraph A. And you may not be able to answer this question, but we still have a hotel licensing board, right? Okay. That licensing board is authorized by this law. So the law is still active, right? And I, subject to the committee, but I think one of our recommendations is likely to be that the government needs to follow hotel aids law or repeal the legislation. I mean, the government is a government and it can do whatever it pleases, so to speak. But I don't think we can continue to have this conflicting interpretation of bespoke legislation. Oh, this is a 1995 revised law. And the other thing that it does is it requires a specific list, material list for the concessions. And if the person imports the concession, this material, does not use them on the site, they have to get customs permission to dispose of them. And we will quite recall the situation with the Ritz-Carlton some time ago, where they got all these concessions. There's still a $6 million loss somewhere around the region. And they have held auctions to sell very expensive Brazilian wood that was imported for some of their stuff at almost sheriff sale rates with no reference back to customs. And I'm certain they didn't go back and pay the duty on it after they sold it. Because our understanding is that because customs does not have the kind of detail in the concession granted, they can't enforce anything. And I don't know about other members, but I have had specific reports quite recently where people have been granted concessions for one facility and they are in fact using the material to build houses and apartments and selling them. And because of the volume in this, I think we need to and I mean, this committee has been, as Mr. Jefferson will be aware, has been trying to tighten up this position for at least 8 years, certainly since I've been here in 2009. Mr. Austin?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to take us back to the jobs issue and the monitoring of concessions, in particular the creation of jobs. Oftentimes we incentivize companies to establish businesses, and we incentivize them through certain subsidies, import duty waivers, in some cases work permit waivers, an easier time in acquiring personnel. The Financial Secretary stipulated that the Ministry of Finance does not at present monitor whether promised job creation is in fact being delivered, and I think he went on to suggest this may be a function of work or one of the employment departments. Because work, Department of Labor and Pensions, and other employment-related agencies of government are not privy to certain concession agreements made at the point of agreement, I wonder if the Financial Secretary can guide this committee as to what information could be provided to relevant government employment agencies so that this monitoring can in fact take place as it relates to concessions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Member Harris for his question. Just conferring that in a short answer to his question, when a cabinet decision is made to grant a concession, that takes the form of a cabinet extract. And cabinet extracts, Mr. Chairman and members, are sent to the best of my knowledge, all members, all ministers of government and all official members. So the relevant chief officer in each of the ministries and portfolios would get a copy of the cabinet extract that detailed the decision. And if one of those conditions were that the concession is granted on the basis of X number of Caymanians being employed, or as many Caymanians as possible being employed, the chief officer in all ministries, even if the subject matter is not theirs, would become knowledgeable as to that decision. And the one obviously in charge of work on the employment-related agencies would become aware of that decision. The further honest position is, Mr. Chairman, that as a matter of routine, the Ministry of Finance does not necessarily pass the approval letters directly to the work agencies. I don't think that we don't pass them. We don't tend to copy the letters coming from finance to the requesting agent applicant, but nonetheless, all ministries' portfolios in government get cabinet extracts.
Mr. Saunders.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, sir, to the Honorable Financial Secretary. Just understanding the process, you said a letter is written to the minister asking for the concession.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Mr. Saunders' question, just a recap of the process. Typically, when someone is requesting a concession, it does start with a letter to the Minister of Finance, or it can sometimes go via another minister. It will end up eventually with the Minister for Finance. Concessions, just by their very nature, it is an iterative process, and you will often have a series of discussions, meetings, letters, to obtain information about the request. Who is requesting it, who the entity is, who the beneficial owners are behind it, what are they proposing to the government, does it fit with the objectives and priorities of the government, a determination as to how feasible the project is it something that can be realized within fairly short order, or is this a much more long-term, long-range type project? Those are the types of things that are taken into consideration and are articulated in a cabinet paper that goes before the cabinet for a decision.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nixon, for that response. The reason I'm asking the question, just to kind of give you the backdrop, and just looking at page 32 of the Auditor General's report, looking at item number 83 and expanding on what my colleague from Prospect had raised. The Ministry of Finance, and I'll read it just for the sake of the public, the Ministry of Finance does not carry out any formal assessments to ensure that the companies or individuals approved for deferred duties payments have sound financial standings to pay the duties in the future. The reason why I'm asking that question, and I am looking at the NAU process, which is a very lengthy, detailed, invasive process of questions that people have to answer just to get a few $100s, or even a food voucher. And then I'm trying to put that in the context of people receiving millions of dollars in concessions from the government in terms of what process do they go through from a vetting process. Because in essence, they're asking for something from the government or for the government to give up something. And I'm trying to compare that between someone looking at a voucher for food, the process that they go through, which I think is like a 6-page document for their own financial standing, and then basically people that look at millions of dollars are basically given a much easier process. I'm trying to weigh those two in terms of, or to better understand the process.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, in terms of the issue of assessment and analysis on persons or entities applying for concessions, the new concessions policy has taken that into consideration and significantly stepped up the sort of due diligence and scrutiny that would be applied for applicants for new concessions. In terms of this paragraph here, paragraph 83, which we interpreted to refer to deferrals of import duty where persons are allowed time frames to repay or to pay their customs duty over. I can report that those circumstances are few and far between in terms of persons who are actually granted deferrals. And there is some scrutiny, but it is not very extensive background check in terms of the ability to repay. And the reason for that is that typically persons who are granted deferrals in most cases are individuals, and it's for a very short period of time, less than 12 months, and for relatively small amounts of money.
Sir, thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman. And one issue that basically comes to mind immediately is the Kapu Festival, where the government has agreed certain concession based on the fact that they would have been doing the festival for at least 5 years. And now we understand that the festival has been canceled. So the question is then, seeing something as material in terms of they receive a concession based on doing something for 5 years, that is not going to happen now. Is there some enforcement or some process where we go back and say, well, guys, we need to claw back at least 80% of what it is that we give you because you have only completed 20% of what it is that you said you would do? I mean, that's the kind of, I'm just trying to understand that in terms of how it fits in.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the Ministry of Finance does monitor active concessions for the key deliverables. And we would monitor things like that, where if someone, so use an example of a developer that was supposed to have started construction by a certain date, obtained planning approval by a certain date, we are monitoring those more closely. And if they have not reached that particular milestone, that is brought to the attention of the minister and the cabinet and an amended concession. So in some cases, a concession may be canceled. In some cases, a concession may be altered. But certainly we are monitoring and flagging those critical deliverables and critical dates.
Mr. I just want to ask a follow-up on this. You keep referring to the new policy, which I'm really delighted to hear that you're coming. I hope we're not back here next year and has got deferred again. But a couple of questions about that. Does the policy that you're proposing to put in place provide for the agreeing to these concessions prior to planning approval? Particularly when it relates to infrastructure fees and duty on material to be used in construction, right? Yeah. Just let them answer that first.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, can you just repeat? Is it prior to?
What I'm asking is the policy for granting concessions. Does it provide that concessions will not be agreed to or granted prior to planning approval? Because certainly one of the simplest things for any developer to do is seek planning approval.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir. The policy, the draft policy, it's fairly extensive, and as I said earlier, it was presented to caucus on Monday. I must say, in all fairness and honesty to the committee, that there was absolutely no resistance to the policy from the ministers and councillors that were there. There was no resistance. The comments received back were they were all for it. They certainly wanted established criteria put in place. They were all for transparency and fairness and integrity. So there's no resistance to the policy. The one stare that we got when we did the discussion was that the policy itself must not be overly prescriptive as to what the cabinet can and can't do, because it was the reserved powers, if you like, of the cabinet in the constitution to make policy. So that was the only stare that we got, that it cannot be overly prescriptive in specifying what the cabinet can do. The policy itself, Mr. Chairman, does speak to, for example, does the government wish to develop certain geographical areas more so than the others by reference to differing percentages of import duties that you offer in, say, East End as opposed to 7 Mile Beach. It speaks to those, but those are obviously for cabinet's consideration. Getting to your question, Mr. Chairman, yes, there is a section in the policy that speaks to the need to reference other agencies. So if you have a project that is dependent upon approval from another agency, that the policy in its application form, there's application forms to be completed and quite extensive, that there's evidence being provided by the applicant, yes, I have planning approval, or
but
not.
What's the point of the policy if it's not going to be sufficiently prescriptive to be enforced? Certainly that does not interfere with cabinet's general condition, because all cabinet has to do is change the policy. But if the policy is going to be so general that they still have the freedom to do as they wish, what's it not worth the paper it's written on?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, what I would obviously say is that the policy was put there before caucus, and ultimately it will be approved by cabinet with possible revisions. It was put there obviously as guidance for them, and certainly the clear impression that we got was that, you know, in the vast majority of times, once we have an agreed policy that is acceptable to the cabinet, in the vast majority of times, cabinet fully intended, ministers fully intended to abide by that policy. But the sentiment stated was that there will be occasions when there's some compelling circumstances which cause the cabinet to deviate from that policy, and that it felt it needed that flexibility in those small percentages of cases.
Mr. General.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of clarity. Thank you for following up on the policy, which isn't in place yet. In the recommendations that relate to the Ministry of Finance around concessions, I noticed most of the implementation dates that management gave were actually June. And I've heard Mr. Nixon say that the Ministry does monitor, whereas the Ministry wasn't monitoring. So I just wanted, for clarity, to just ask whether that means that the things they were intending to do in June are now done, and so the responses being given are post-June, just to completely be clear. Thank you.
Then you can tell us which ones were done before Jones and which ones are still outstanding.
Mr. Chairman, just as a matter of clarity, I realize now, and just from my last statement, that we are getting into the policy in terms of the Ministry of Finance, and I couldn't help but wonder, recognizing that the Constitution gives Cabinet the responsibility to develop policy, if some of the questions relating to policy shouldn't be directed to the Minister of Finance as opposed to the Chief Officer, and because technically they are not equipped to answer policy, and I think it's kind of unfair. I know they're very polite and be nice, but I
I
think
think they're fully equipped to answer us on the policy that they're about to implement, that they're about to get.
yeah. So I just wanted to put that out there to the public that at the end of the day, the policy is still that of the Minister of Finance and the Cabinet, and not the Chief Officer.
And we accept that the Public Accounts Committee does not normally interfere with policy, but I think it is quite relevant for the public authorities, based on a report, to question a policy that we've been asking for 8 years, if the policy that is being implemented does achieve the things that the Public Accounts Committee and Auditor Generals have been recommending for years, before it is passed into law.
Mr. Chairman, if I can just assist that, because, well, it's the question of policy and
was the timelines that the Minister of Finance gave for implementation. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So I was going to say, for clarity, earlier on Mr. Jefferson said they weren't out at building sites monitoring employment, yet Mr. Nixon then said, we now monitor the key provisions. I was just trying to get clarity about whether one was talking about the time frame in which we did the audit and Mr. Nixon talking subsequently, because I noticed the implementation dates were June. So I was just after clarity around what's happened recently. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the Ministry of Finance has internally changed its practices prior to the 30th of June 2019 to make sure that we would get ready for the adoption of the formal policy. So while we're not making site visits, we are tracking any concessions that do have key deliverables in terms of dates, whether it's expiration of a concession, it is that a developer or contractor has to meet a certain time frame. Those are being flagged and tracked, and with the developer or whoever's awarded the concession to find out whether or not they are complying with them. In terms of the issue of employment and jobs that are being created, we've already touched on that. I will just take the committee back to when those types of conditions were being applied to concessions. It was envisaged at that time that Department of Labor and Pensions and NWDA would be the agencies that would be able to do that. However, very early on, we met with them and discovered that they were having extreme difficulty in collecting this information. And Councillor Harris, earlier in his contribution, spoke to emails that some developers were providing. That is true, sir. And those emails I know have happened. What was then NWDA was having difficulty in being able to vet and to follow up to see if what the people were reporting was in fact the situation on the ground. With all of the systems development that is happening now at the new work agency, it is hoped that on the labor front at least, that would become far easier and automated, both easier for the entity that's reporting it, but also for the government agency to be able to vet it, to see what is actually going on from the labor front. In terms of moving forward with public reporting, etc., being able to track the actual value consumed against these concessions, that has been a work in progress. The Minister of Finance knows in aggregate what has been approved. What we have difficulty with is what has actually been consumed against it. That again has been a work in progress, and maybe when the customs folks come in later today, they can speak to it. They also have had a massive change to their IT systems over the last several years, the various iterations to improve the reliability of information that they have. So, for instance, someone may be approved for a concession of up to $100,000 for something. It's not until those goods are actually cleared and processed by customs do we know whether the goods that are cleared are $50,000, $80,000 worth of duty, $100,000, $200,000 worth of duty. it's not until that point do we know what that duty is. So a concession is approved and granted in advance of the clearance of the goods. The custom systems previously did not allow them to be able to properly track and report the amounts consumed. They have made amendments to their systems and should very shortly be able to produce the detailed reports, which would allow us to be able to comply with the intended revenue concession policy.
Sorry, you had a follow-up on your particular, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just sticking with page 32 and the whole issue of policy. The Auditor General's Office in recommendation number 9 provides what seems to me anyway to be a clear blueprint as to what that concession policy should look like and what the Ministry of Finance vis-a-vis the government should be seeking to develop. And they state specifically, the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development should develop a formal, comprehensive concession policy and procedures that sets out consistent roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities, and includes criteria for the assessment of concession requests. Now, if I were to break that sentence down into 2 words or less, it tells me that the Auditor General is recommending that the Ministry of Finance, when approving or setting the criteria for concessions, needs to incorporate some form of concession agreement in various contracts. The first question is, if the witnesses would agree, Mr. Chairman, can they stipulate whether a concession agreement is either being drafted, has been drafted, or will form part of a policy going forward in accordance with recommendation number 9?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Member Harrison. Through you, Mr. Chairman. The member is absolutely correct, sir, in that the policy does include in a section entitled decision criteria, the relevant considerations that should be taken into account when deciding whether to grant a requested waiver or not, or a concession or not. So it speaks, for example, to relevance, and some of the questions that are put for what will ultimately be Cabinet's consideration is the project or program relevant to government strategy? Does it fit within current government policy? Another section is entitled transparency. Is the applicant of reputable character, or does it warrant doing business in the Cayman Islands? Are they treated fairly? Have all conflicts of interest been declared? Feasibility is another factor to be taken into consideration. And under feasibility, there are questions posed such as, is the project or program feasible? It's not going to collapse before it reaches the end. Has the project, the financing for the project been confirmed before obviously a decision is taken to grant any concession? And what are the risks to the project not being completed? And then the final section as a criteria would be what impact granting a concession would have on government's revenue and government's policy. Is it a significant loss of revenue or not? So those are the criteria stated in the draft policy document that the Cabinet would be ultimately asked to consider. Mr. Chairman, just in terms of practicality as well, the policy envisages that the Ministry of Finance essentially be the hub for all of the concessions coming into government. So the Ministry of Finance would get to deal with a request for planning fees being waived. So anything even outside of the domain of the ministry itself, but once it's a concession, Ministry of Finance would be the hub and would control things. The policy speaks to the need to present complete checklists, and the checklist obviously asks for different pieces of information, proof as to the good standing of a company, etc., if it is a company involved. And then those completed applications and details are essentially vetted by and considered by the Ministry of Finance. And it can use the help of other agencies if the project is particularly complicated. So we could draw on persons from planning, we could draw from persons from the environment if it was an environmental issue that we considered that might arise. So those are some of the workings or the thinkings within the policy itself. And to finally answer Member Harris's question, yes, the policy does speak to large concessions, and it defines what a large concession is. And it goes on to say that in the event that a large concession is requested, that a concession agreement would have to be signed with the applicant and the government if the decision is to award the concession. So there would be an agreement in place that speaks to, for example, satisfaction of certain conditions to make that grant. I hope that's helpful to the committee.
Just to follow up, Mr. Chairman, first of all, I'm delighted to see that the recommendations outlined in recommendation number 9 by the Auditor General are in fact being followed as it relates to concessions and the establishment of a concession plan and concession agreement. Earlier we talked about being able to monitor these concessions, and some of the shortfalls were lack of communication of respective concessions being made and what departments are responsible for following up and tracking that. Those departments that have been identified, for example, speaking specifically to employment concessions, we've heard from the employment agencies that they lack the resources in which to do that follow-up. I wonder if the concession agreement also contains the criteria for a concession management plan, whereby we put the responsibility of delivering these stated concessions between two parties, the government and the entity, on the entity to manage these concessions. Is that a consideration? Because I see a managed concessions management plan as one of the pillars of an effective concession agreement. I wonder if the witnesses would agree.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, yes, the concessions management plan from the perspective of enforcing any sort of concessions agreement and to ensure that both parties are essentially meeting their obligations under a concessions agreement is definitely envisaged and captured in the policy.
What penalties are going to be in those concession agreement? Right now, if I don't declare something at the airport and it's discovered that it was durable, 3 or 5 times a due date? Are similar penalties being put when these people depart from what they say they're going to do? Or what penalties are included in this policy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The penalties have not been specified, but they would be, currently they're not specified in the policy, but it is envisaged that they would be very similar to what exists now, as well as they may involve other things depending upon the specific agreement. So in some cases, the agreements may involve us placing liens against property. Sorry, lost my train of thought there. But the intention is to have very clear sanctions for non-compliance specified in the agreements.
Mr. Chairman, just to assist the committee a bit further on that particular aspect, it does speak to the consequences of a breach. And whilst they're not explicitly stated, it speaks to general areas such as termination of the concession is possible. It speaks to I think one of the members asked earlier on, payment of funds that were previously waived is a possible penalty under this agreement. And of course, any legal action that the government may have to take to recover and protect its government revenue. So the agreement, the policy does actually have general areas that would be drafted in more explicit details when it came to a particular concession that was granted. Would be drafted specifically to detail the penalties and consequences of breaching the agreement.
Any other questions on the concessions?
No, non-concessions, no. I just want to change gear to something else.
Okay, no, yeah, but I want to talk about revenue as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, through you. Just looking at the Auditor General's report, in particular, starting in the area of, on page 21, speaking about the TRIP system, a total of roughly $970,000, close to $1 million, was... in terms of the project concerning the trips, where roughly $970,000, close to $1 million was written off. We're trying to understand in terms of one, how did that happen, but two, more importantly, what lessons have we learned from that, and what are we going to do going forward to make sure something like that doesn't happen again?
Thank you, Member Saunders and Mr. Chairman, for the committee benefit. TRIPS stands for Total Revenue Integrated Processing System. Just a little bit of history very quickly. Round about 2014, the government made a decision that it wanted to implement new customs tariff codes, 8-digit codes, that the selling point for doing those was that the government would get much more detailed information as to the type of imports coming into the islands. And so by way of a very simple example, it might be that if previously the customs tariff law used a general tariff that covered breads and flour, I don't know if it does, but just by way of illustration, what the 8-digit code would give the government would be much more detailed information. So it might say, instead of breads and flour as a general category, it might then say code number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 actually refers to wheat bread. And so forth. So it was sold to the government at the time by civil servants. If you want better decision-making abilities, you need a greater level of code. And a greater level of code requires a different system to what you have now. And to be brutally frank, the amount of, I would say, procurement, analysis, and shopping around was limited. It was decided that the best, at the time, the best system to obtain was a system from Crown agents in the UK. That turned out to be not great at all. And it actually was, there should have been red flags from the very beginning, because the implementation of that system in the Cayman Islands was the very first use of that particular piece of software. So we were the first ones. At the time, I think, to be fair to them, I think computer services were asked if they could develop something in-house. And they either said they didn't have the time to do it within the time frame that the government wanted to introduce the law, or they didn't have the technical capabilities. So computer services were asked, but they couldn't manage it. So we went on our merry way, and we acquired this system from the UK. And the very first time it was in operation, it gave lots of problems. Apparently it shut down quite frequently. And if you are an importer and you're standing in line and it shut down on you, 3 hours later, customs officers were having to put back in all over again the information that you'd spent 3 hours ago trying to give them. So it was very problematic for customs and members of the general public. It was also said to be not secure. It wasn't a very secure system at all. And there was fear that, hacking was certainly real, even within the Cayman Islands or outside the Cayman Islands. And I don't think importers were very comfortable with, their imports being known to others, to their competitors. And so that was a major concern as well. So it was fraught with a lot of difficulties. Mr. Chairman, in terms of lessons learned, I think that it is clear that it should be a red flag if a country is acquiring a product for the very first time and no one else has had it in operation. That should certainly be a lesson learned, and to avoid that. Mr. Chairman, we now perhaps into tomorrow's area, but we now have the procurement regime, the procurement law, the procurement regulations, which call for business cases where the value of the item that an agency in government is acquiring is $100,000 and more. You have to do a business case, and the requirements, and that's specified in the law. And that business case requires the relevant agency to specify in particular the risk to the project. In terms of the amount written off, we obviously recognize that it was substantial, 970,000 I think it was, for the year. I think with the year ending 18. Was it? Was it 28? No? 2018, sorry, Mr. Chairman. 970,000 was written off from the books of the Ministry of Finance in 2018. I think that's the sensible thing to have done. The accounting standards rules would require that if you have any asset that's useless and its value is negligible, you wouldn't continue carrying it on your books with a value of 970,000. You should write it off if it's no use to you. So we actually did that, and it was noted in the Auditor General's report as being a substantial write-off. So there should be lots of lessons learned, Mr. Chairman, from what I've described. We're certainly hopeful that the new procurement regime would frustrate that from happening again in the future. We now have the requirement, as I said, where these business cases are required, and there's at least two levels of scrutiny. If it's 100,000 or more, you have what is referred to as an entity procurement committee, which looks at acquisitions by government, procurement by the public sector, and if it rises to 250,000 and over, there is a public procurement committee, which is separate to the entity procurement, and the public procurement committee does, in practice, look to see if there is approval for business cases by the lower entity procurement committee. So there should be a lot more scrutiny of acquisitions of this nature currently now, and much more bodies involved, and that in itself should frustrate the possibility of what occurred in customs many years ago.
Mr. Chairman, through you, and thank Mr. Jefferson for that answer. I'm just trying to understand in terms of the process going forward, and you say public, if that will include the statutory authorities. And the reason why I'm asking this question, Mr. Chairman, is that when I consider what had happened with the care payer system, where, again, we were guinea pigs in terms of that whole process, which would have included Cynical, which would have fallen under the Ministry of Finance. And then you also look at the HSA with the Cerner billing system, not in terms of the Cerner system, but the billing module, which, again, the HSA was a guinea pig for, because they had never rolled it out before. I mean, considering those issues that we have had in the past, and then coupled with this now in terms of becoming guinea pigs, which have now in essence cost the country millions of dollars. The question is, in terms of the oversight or the governance, I mean, granted that one issue is central government and one is in a statutory authority, is there an overarching body that looks also across the entire public sector to make sure that the lessons that we're learning, that happens, the things that happen also in the SAGC is factored into central government also. Because at the end of the day, where the public is concerned, this is still just government, even though, I mean, on the books, we know that they are kind of separate.
Thank you, Member Saunders. Mr. Chairman, through you, the member is absolutely correct in that the procurement law and regulations applies not only to central government, but to the entire public sector. So the statutory authorities and government companies, they fall under the regime of the public procurement law and the regulations, the procurement regulations. Those came, Mr. Chairman, those came into effect, I think it was the 1st of May 2018. It had been, the law itself had been passed almost like 2 years earlier, so there was quite a lot of lead time there. But the law is now in effect and applies to all public entities, government included, statutory authorities included, and so the Public Procurement Committee, Mr. Chairman, that we spoke about, which consists, I think, of about eight members. Yourself, as the former leader of the opposition, was entitled to appoint one person to the committee. The deputy governor appoints possibly 3, and the premier, I think, has an ability to appoint 4 members, all outside of government, Mr. Chairman. So we should get that external scrutiny, and hopefully that will frustrate, avoid, minimize the chances of what the member has spoken about happening again.
Can we get back a little bit to the revenue projection, since we're in the process of preparing the 2021 budget? Is what is being done to make the budget, the revenue projections from customs, more accurate? Because here's my concern. When we under budget, and you can go back to the 70s, customs was always given accolades every year because they exceeded their budgeted allotment, and therefore there was no scrutiny and no concern of whether they were collecting all the revenue they should collect or not. But when you get this kind of high percentage variances, one has to question whether the budget preparation is adequate and whether it is given fair consideration to factors that will impact the budget, i.e., what has been approved at planning, what is the population growth, has a new supermarket been opened, etc., etc. Because when you deprive me of getting a couple of $1,000 for a senior citizen program in Northside because customs has under budgeted by what in this case was $22 million, we're depriving our citizenship of services that they need because we're allowing a department to under budget in order to get the accolades because they went over the budget that they project. So in changes being made in the way customs revenue budget is being prepared for 2021, given the history of consistently under budgeting the performance. Yeah, and is it prepared by you or is it prepared by Customs Department?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I understand your position and what led to the question, sir. Certainly, what I've seen in recent times, i.e., this year, in terms of the preparation of the revenue estimates for customs import duty lines that go into the budget, it has been a collaboration between customs itself. They have more control now over the estimation, and I think that simply reflects the fact that the customs department has moved from under the ambit of the Ministry of Finance to a different ministry. But I have seen in March, April this year, email correspondence between finance officials in the Customs Department and the Economics and Statistics Office officials, where their input, ESO's input, is sought on the revenue estimates that are being proposed. I've seen where those emails have gone back and forth and comments made, for example, by the ESO that the level of the price of gasoline and diesel products have changed significantly in recent times, but the import duty is based on volumes, and there's back and forth. Also, Mr. Chairman, there has been reference to the Ministry of Finance, the revenue unit within the Ministry of Finance, which honestly is only one person. So he has got involved in the revenue estimation process as well. So the revenue estimate numbers for 2020 and 2021 is a reflection, a collaboration between customs, the ESO, and the revenue unit. I honestly can't say, Mr. Chairman, whether that's going to result in a much tighter number than before, but I see that the effort is definitely being made to improve the revenue forecasting in customs. I have no evidence, Mr. Chairman and committee members, that there's anything deliberate being done to understate the revenue estimates, and then when the actual revenues come in, they're in excess of that, and therefore congratulations are called for. I don't have any evidence of that at all. So I think every effort has been made to improve the revenue estimation process, and I have seen email correspondence to that effect back and forth. I take the Auditor General's comments that in her report that there was no evidence of past collaboration and they couldn't get evidence of that. I mean, that's, Mr. Chairman, that's most unfortunate, because I'm absolutely convinced that the collaboration has always taken place. It is really unfortunate if it wasn't recorded, but I know the collaboration has taken place, even if it's by phone. But I do concede that it is very difficult to believe that it shouldn't have been evidenced in some documented form. That's unusual.
Mr. Chairman, through you, sir, and just to expand on the issue you raised a while ago, I'm looking at page 139 on the Compendium of Statistics that is prepared by the Economics and Statistics Office. And considering that the budget for the 2018 that Mr. Jefferson had spoke about earlier, I just want to read the numbers or the import duties that's highlighted as per the report. In 2012, 153 million. 2013, 158.2 million. 2014, 162.6 million. 2015, 156 million. 2016, 158.4 million. And 2017, 161.9 million. Now, considering that, looking at the last 3 years, 2015, 2016, 2017, of 156 million, 158.4 million, and 161.9 million, and then considering the government's own projection and growth in the local economy, I am beginning to wonder, why is it then that the budget number that was used for 2018 of 156 million is pretty much the same actual result as what we got in 2015, considering about 2016 and 2017 was higher. So going back even 3 years, we would have seen that the average would have been higher than what we budgeted last year. And then you factor in the growth in the population and so forth. We're trying to at least get some idea of how can the 2 previous years have been higher in actual. We're expecting growth, but we still went back and we budgeted less for 2018 of 156 million, which is the actual for 2015.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I noted most of the numbers. I didn't get them all, but I certainly understand what Member Saunders is getting at. Mr. Chairman, the best response I could make would be to give an undertaking to the committee to attempt to explain why the later years, the revenue projections were much the same as even actuals in previous years. I can't do that here and now, but I would undertake to get an answer and give it to the committee. It does, on the face of it, it does look a bit curious.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just one of the things, and which is pretty much my final question, because I recognize that we are, I guess, well over time. Just, well, two final questions, really. In terms of the duties actually paid by the major merchants and so forth, is that duty paid immediately as the goods come in, or do we normally extend credit to some of the supermarkets? Or they pay upfront?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know the precise answer to that. I do know that merchants, I'll start by saying that the general position should be, the general principle should be that as items are imported into the islands, the duty becomes payable immediately. Right? That's the general principle. I do know that for example, some of the large supermarkets, they do, for perishables in particular, they do have deposits with customs, and as the imports come in, the value of those deposits that are drawn down, and importers do have to keep topping it back up, and they're drawn down. Apart from that, and apart from any concessions granted that we were talking about earlier, there should not be significant delays in the collection of revenue. It should be on the spot. But perhaps the collector could answer that. The director.
And base of revenue, who's responsible for reviewing the rates of duty? Is that something that the Minister of Finance does, or is that left for customs to review the rates and make recommendations to the ministry of what could be increased or what should be decreased?
Mr. Chairman, we haven't, in the Ministry of Finance, we haven't undertaken that exercise for quite some time. We haven't done that at all. I think it's more the case of, over the years, customs officials have recommended certain changes, and also, Mr. Chairman, pressure input from members of the public as to changes to the import duty rates, and obviously, honourable ministers of government as well have made changes to import duty rates, and in particular, during much more difficult economic times in the Cayman Islands, have lowered and sometimes made many items duty-free. So the sources for change of the import duty rates come from various quarters, the public, ministers themselves, customs officials, and I don't remember, to be honest with you, Mr. Chairman, the Minister of Finance initiating a review of import duty rates.
Because, as I recall, there are only two items imported in this country that are not imported on cost, insurance, and freight. That's alcohol and fuel. Has the Minister of Finance ever performed an exercise to see whether how much duty you're losing on liquor, for instance? Because if I buy a $4 bottle of rum in Cuba, when I come, if I'm over the limit, it's what, $11 per liter. But if I buy a $500 bottle of rum, it's still only $11. And it's always been curious to me personally, what lobby exists in the country that is able to promote those two items in particular to be treated differently from every other thing that's imported into the country, and whether there is, in fact, what we are doing is the poor people are subsidizing the rich people, because the $3,000 bottle of wine is $11 and the QQ a rum that the poor people are drinking is $11 too. So I'm wondering if that's an exercise that government should not undertake. And when it gets to fuel, when we interrogate off reg, they tell us that they can't control the prices because they don't know what the cost is, because they only get reported, government only knows what volume was imported. And they have no way of knowing whether it is being triple price, double price, 12, or whatever. So it may be something that the finance minister may want to take on and take a shipment of alcohol and apply a percentage duty to it, cost, insurance, and freight, versus volume, and see if there's a difference in whether who's winning and who's losing. Any other questions for the?
Yeah, just one last area I want to touch on, Mr. Chairman, and this relates to the issue of governance. Just looking at page 6 of the Auditor General's report and reading roughly in the last sentence from point number 5, where it says, the Customs Department operated in 3 sections: administration, revenue collection, and border protection, each headed up by a deputy collector. Then the next sentence goes on to say, the finance unit was headed up by the finance manager and reported directly to the collector of customs. The 3 sections cover the following, which is administration, revenue collection, and border protection. What I'm trying to understand from a governance standpoint is, why is a finance function not part of the administrative function, which would be like HR, IT? Why is that treated differently? Or why is, I'm just trying to understand why that one's an outlier from the other administrative sections.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, sir. I don't know the answer to Member Saunders' question. Again, perhaps with the collector being next, that's an area that could be addressed with him without meaning to pass the buck. I don't know for the moment the real answer to what Member Saunders has asked.
Yeah, no, what I'm just trying to understand is more the governance model. Because one of the things, if you look within the public service management law, the overall responsibility is within the chief officers. And what we're trying to understand, and one of the things that we're trying to, enhance across the civil service is a culture of, accountability, whereas the ministries and everybody is watching departments to make sure they're doing what it is that they're supposed to be doing, that kind of thing. Because, ultimately, yes, we do know the collector of customs will, but from a ministry standpoint, in terms of what does a ministry do in terms of monitoring the different departments under their remit, and pretty much just do you have regular departmental meetings? Do you get into the HR issues? Do you get into just kind of understanding, just the overall governance in terms of, who's checking who's making sure that everyone is doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, prior to or before Customs Department left the Ministry of Finance, there was a senior assistant financial secretary who had responsibility for customs within the Ministry of Finance, and so certainly was quite good oversight, knowledge of what was happening in customs from her knowledge and keeping contact with officials in customs. But I think just as good as that or better, we have bi-weekly meetings held by the Minister for Finance, and they're currently still going on, subject to some having to push dates back because of budget preparation and so forth. But there has been consistently bi-weekly meetings between the Minister of Finance and heads of department on the finance. So ESO, director, attends those meetings. The Collector of Customs then attended those meetings. Accountant General attended those meetings, and various senior other officials within the Ministry of Finance. And written reports were prepared and submitted and considered at those meetings. And in particular, I recall from Customs there was discussions around how the revenues were performing. There was a section on HR and personnel and what changes were taking place. There were sections within his report that dealt with shall we say, security issues, arrests, and so forth. It got to the point where we were almost expecting every 2 weeks to read about a person leaving the Cayman Islands being apprehended with a firearm. So there was fairly good feedback from the collective customs to the Minister of Finance every 2 weeks, and it covered those areas that I talked about. Certainly the revenue estimates were there, as well as HR and.
I think Mr. Saunders is asking more from the governance model is who is responsible. For instance, who is responsible to make sure that customs meets their revenue projections? Is that somebody in finance, or who's held accountable if perchance it never happens, they don't collect the amount that they were supposed to collect?
Thanks. Mr. Chairman, not in finance now, but it was when we were on the finance, and the ultimate person responsible is the chief officer for whichever ministry customs happens to fall under. Currently, it's obviously within the Ministry of Employment and Border Control, so the chief officer of that ministry would ultimately be responsible.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank Mr. Jefferson for the answer, and it confirms my high confidence in the finance function. I must say that from being here a little over 2 years, I have found the Ministry of Finance to be one of the better run ministries. They're normally the first with their reports, and one that actually has some of the least adjustments that we have seen even from the Auditor General's report. So from that standpoint, I just want to thank Mr. Jefferson and his team for the job that they have done. I think we have a very good finance team, I must say that. And I know we went over a lot of things, but I think you guys answered questions as bluntly and frankly as we could want, and that's all we can ask for. I just want to ask one last question, Mr. Chairman, which is my standard question. Is there anything that you gentlemen believe that we as legislators can do or need to do in terms of changing any laws or anything that would basically enhance the process or make customs better, or just anything overall? If you don't have an answer immediately, no, that's fine. It's something you can always get back to us with, but we kind of always put that there because we're always trying to look at ways in which we can improve what it is that we do. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, I do have one question relevant to the Auditor General's report that is contained on page 34 and is found in paragraph 89 that we haven't touched on. The Auditor General's report identified this section as the extent of tax gap being unclear in the Cayman Islands. Now, for the benefit of those listening in, we hear the word tax and gap, and then automatically the listener attention says we're a tax-free jurisdiction. That doesn't apply to us. How do we even bother to calculate this type of conversation? But what the point that the Auditor General is making, I think, is a sound point, because it speaks to the value, the real value of goods and services that represents revenue to the country versus the concessions that we agree on time and time again, which is virtually giving up revenue for the country, representing lost revenue. And some points of discussion highlighted by the Auditor General were very topical conversations. We look at the government's agreement with DART, 2010, $1 billion worth of infrastructure investment, but also what the government gave up in land and otherwise. It gave the example of Hell City and the numerous inducements, including $800 million in customs duty concessions. The Auditor General went on to stipulate, first of all, the tax gap refers to the difference between the total amounts of taxes owed to the government compared to the actual amounts received. Again, if we substitute the word taxes for revenue, it goes on to state that neither Customs nor the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development calculates the extent of tax gap or revenue loss, so they do not know how much revenue is potentially lost to the government. Now, I'm no accountant, but there are standard methodologies that are used by accountants to determine loss of revenue. And they are the before and after method, the benchmark or yardstick method. There are revenue trend analysis methods that are standard in accounting and standard in general business principle. When the government is, or the ministry, is seeking to apply, as we spoke about earlier on, a concession agreement, which may very well include a concession management plan. Is it possible to utilize these standard accounting principles to determine lost revenue so that we can manage, or at least be able to stipulate, how much money the country is giving up as a result of concessions versus the amount of money that it could otherwise, that it is granting in import duties? Again, I think sometimes get bogged down on the word tax and think that's a lacuna and something that is outside of our remit as a tax-free jurisdiction. But my question is, cannot the simple practices of lost revenue calculation or otherwise be used in this scenario stipulated by the Auditor General so that the people can understand how much revenue the country is truly giving up when we agree on concessions for companies or business interests?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Member Harris for his astute observations, and I think he posed the situation in the Auditor General's report quite well. Mr. Chairman, members will see in paragraph 90 of the Auditor General's report how the tax gap is defined as including the following: import duties wrongly applied. And I think what that obviously means, Mr. Chairman, is that if you have a situation where import duty that should have been charged at 22% was actually charged at 14%, that is a loss of revenue. Non-declaration of goods imported, you simply cheat. An importer cheats and doesn't declare the full value of items imported. That's a loss of revenue to the government as well. But I think the lion's share of the tax gap would have to come from the last bullet point that is mentioned. The concession or waivers on duty would be the vast majority of any figure that is calculated. And just very quickly, sir, I think we need to decide whether we want the tax gap purely for knowledge, and you're not going to do anything else with it. You just want to know you've given away X million in the course of a year, or you want to know it because you want to take action to replace it with another source of revenue of equal or lesser amount. So it obviously can be both, but it's what's the principle driving that tax gap? Knowledge, taking action. The calculation, Mr. Chairman, of the tax gap is made very, very difficult for the government at the moment, simply because we do not have a good handle on the value of concessions that are essentially drawn down. So we should be able to compile fairly easily a list, a register of the concessions granted with the dollar figures applied against each of those. But the further step is to say, well, in 2019, were all of those amounts drawn down or only 50%? So I think that's at the moment the difficulty that we're having in government to be able to come up with a number as to the value of the concessions that have actually been utilized in the course of a year. I know, Mr. Chairman, that there's been discussions with the Minister of Finance and Customs on improving their computer systems to enable that to take place, but that is not the reality right now. There is deficiencies there. So the first step, Mr. Chairman, the first step in this whole tax gap exercise would certainly be the finalization of the concessions policy to determine, to help guide as to what should or should not be subject of a concession. This step number 2 should be making sure that the information gathering systems that we have in place in government, in particular at customs, are able to capture what amount of concession are being drawn down each year would be step number 2. And then I think the calculation should be straightforward thereafter. And then the government would decide, do we simply do this calculation for the purpose of our knowledge and the public knowledge, or are we going to attempt to recover some or all of the gap by application of revenue measures in another area? I think that's the summary I would give, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses for their attendance and certainly their willingness to answer the questions as put to them. As always, it is a pleasure to have that kind of witness. We thank you for your time and taking you away from your very busy schedule. I have no more questions, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Nixon, just let me thank you for your indulgence and answering the questions and enlightening us in many areas, and we look forward to that policy being implemented and carrying sufficient details that we can monitor it. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and other committee members.
Thank you.
I, Charles Clifford, swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this honorable legislative assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Affirmation.
I, Camille Beckford Johnson, do solemnly declare, sincerely and truthfully declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give to this Honorable Legislative Assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Apologize that Parliament can't afford it. One mic short.
We're going to collect you some more dues.
That'll help us do that.
I, Jeffrey Kevin Walton, swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this Honorable Legislative Assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Can you turn that one around? So that you reach that one. Thank you, Mr. Charles Clifford, the Director of the Cayman Islands Customs and Border Control. We thank you for accepting our invitation, and we look forward to an informative session. We apologize for the delay in keeping you outside for close to an hour, but that was because the Minister of Finance was being so forthcoming and generous in their answers. So, in fact, they may have shortened your time by some of the answers they have given. But so, welcome you. The rules are, when you're asked the first question, you just identify yourself by name and title, so that it appears. That's just for the records and the Hansard. So, welcome, and I think Mr. Saunders, if sorry, you don't need to give another. Mr. Saunders, you want to start off?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, sorry, I hate to interrupt my colleague, but as a matter of housekeeping. Mr. Chairman and committee members, it is my duty to disclose conflict of interest by virtue of my being counselor for Border Control. As such, I wish to recuse myself from this part of the Q&A, but I will humbly request that I be allowed to remain in the chamber to listen to the questions being asked.
Yeah, you're granted, Mr. Saunders.
Problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And through you, Mr. Chairman, just going straight into the report on page 15, looking at items 37, 38, and 39, and just reading it just for the witnesses' benefit. Number 37 says, Custom does not collect information to measure performance against the output specified in the annual plans and estimate. There is therefore no mechanism in place to report performance against the measure set. Neither does Customs have comprehensive performance information or a performance management system in place to support effective decision making and to help manage your business. 38 goes on to says, we were told that the Customs had started to develop a performance management system in 2016, but this was never implemented because it was hard to allocate time and cost against particular objectives, which made the development of performance measures difficult. The system was also limited because the proposed measures were for border protection only and did not include revenue collection, trade facilitation, or corporate functions. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, number 39 says, Customs does measure its performance in relation to the collection of revenues and it report this information monthly to the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development. However, this performance information is limited to outputs, the value of revenues collected, the type of duty, fee, or fine. It does not include any efficiency or effectiveness measures, such as the cost per dollar or revenue collected. What we're just trying to understand, or would like to know, Mr. Chairman, through you to the witness, is basically the what plans are in place in terms of to develop or implement the performance measures that covers inputs, outputs, and outcomes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Charles Clifford, Director of Customs and Border Control. As the report indicates, we have in draft form a performance measurement system, but we need to do substantially more work on that at this point. We understand and value performance indicators and developing a matrix to measure performance. Mr. Chairman, it is a work in progress. We have recently merged the original Customs Department with the Border Control components of the Immigration Department. That has impacted a number of things because our scope has expanded as a result of that. But it is a project that we are going to be actively working on and bringing greater focus to. In addition to that, the performance indicators that are listed as an example in the annual plan and estimate, we have continued to improve upon those, and you will see those improvements reflected in the 2020 and 2021 budgets. But there are some elements of our work and performance that it is difficult to develop performance indicators for. As an example, investigations. When you look at things like the timeliness of an investigation, it depends on the nature of an investigation. I would say that most investigations, an average investigation, can probably be wrapped up within a 30 to 60 day period, whereas you could have an investigation that involves international connections that could span several years. So those are just some of the challenges we have in terms of trying to make sure that we have a meaningful performance measurement plan and policy in place. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the Director also for that response. It's greatly appreciated. Just want to get a quick update, and this is relating to page 12 of the 28 and 29, points 28 and 29 of the Auditor General reports with regards to the strategic planning and strategic planning. We know that something was basically being worked on before, but that was put on hold because of the creation of the whole the CBC. Has there been an update in terms of where we are in terms of developing the strategic plan for the CBC?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we have made progress on that, and let me just back up from that to say that when I was appointed as Collector Customs back in August 2015, there were, for the want of a better description, a number of fires burning at the time. And my objectives and the things that I know I needed to focus on had to be prioritized. So I had a list of priorities, and then I had to create priorities within priorities to address those. Fortunately, I also found a group of officers, including administrative officers, who were extremely hardworking, ready to serve, ready to continue to serve, and ready to commit themselves to change. So there were obvious things, Mr. Chairman, such as the need to create 3 clearly defined portfolios and then to rationalize the various sections within the department under those 3 portfolios. So those were quick wins, low-hanging fruit. I didn't need a strategic plan to tell me I needed to do that. And it was more important for me to achieve these things as early as possible rather than spending the first 6 months looking at a strategic plan. So in order to provide some context, I just wanted to say that. As we progressed with implementing various changes within the department, we also had 2 of our long-serving deputies retire from the department, and they were replaced by 2 assistant collectors. So that sort of set the stage then for the beginning of the transformation of border control in the Cayman Islands. And at that point, we began to speak about, okay, now is the time, we've achieved certain basic objectives. Let us move forward now with a proper strategic plan to chart the course. forward. That, unfortunately, or fortunately, was overtaken by the policy announcement in relation to the merger in late 2017. So I took the decision at that point that we would pause our plans to develop a strategic plan for the Customs Department, because there was no point in doing so when we would have to then renew the plan within a matter of months once the merger had taken place. So what we also looked at, and I know this is a long answer, but what we also looked at was whether we should put in place a strategic plan to manage the merger. But we had such a compressed time frame within which to achieve the merger, that didn't seem feasible either. So we knew that we had 4 basic objectives that we needed to achieve in order to have the 2 agencies merged in time for the beginning of this year, 2019. And those 4 objectives were: we needed a new name and a new uniform, obvious things like that. We consulted staff extensively on that. They decided what they wanted for a uniform, and they made recommendations in relation to the name. We also knew that we needed to have the legislation in place. So we needed to look at repealing the existing customs law, repealing elements of the existing immigration law, and then merging those and making what improvements we could in the interim to create a customs and border control law. We also knew that we needed to reconcile salaries and job descriptions for the former customs and former immigration officers, because there were differences in salaries and we couldn't have a merged agency essentially with people of equal rank earning different salaries. So at the top level, those were the things that we knew we needed to achieve. And Mr. Chairman, when we talk about reconciliation of salaries and job descriptions, that was quite an undertaking, because we had to rewrite all job descriptions for the new agency, have them valued by the portfolio of the civil service, salaries assigned, etc. So that was a substantial undertaking. So we knew we needed to get these basic things in order to merge the 2 agencies. And we decided that we would do that. We would focus on those things rather than trying to build out a strategic plan within that compressed time frame. And then after the merger, we would look then, once we had a clearly defined department with clear objectives, mission statement, etc., we would then build out a meaningful strategic plan. So we are now, I think, 7.5 months into the merger, and we are now looking at building out that plan. What I have done so far is to have consulted with the strategic reforms implementation unit within government to see whether they could assist us with preparing a strategic plan, because I didn't want to take any of my senior staff away from their duties to spend a substantial amount of time focusing on a strategic plan. We know what our objectives are and what they need to be over the next several years, but we need some assistance in putting that plan together. I didn't want to go to one of the big 4 companies and pay them $500,000 to create a strategic plan. We felt that within central government, we had the resources to do that. The Strategic Reforms Implementation Unit advised me that they didn't have the resources within their unit, but they referred me to the Management Support Unit within the portfolio of the Civil Service. And they have indicated that they can assist. And in fact, there's a meeting with them next week to begin to progress this matter. So that is essentially where we are at this point, Mr. Chairman. And the strategic plan that we're looking at is a 5-year strategic plan. We think that while we have achieved the basic elements of a merger in terms of we are all operating under one brand in one uniform at this point, the functional merger and the operational merger is quite a different matter. That's a multi-year project because it involves a lot of training and cross-training, etc. And so we're looking at it sort of in 5-year increments, and we'll plan the way forward for the next 5 years. I will end my answer on this note. We consulted quite extensively with our colleagues in the US and in the UK and in Canada on the merger. And while those are much larger countries, they've undertaken similar mergers. And the issues that we expect to encounter locally are no different, or very, very little difference to what they encountered in those bigger countries. It's just a difference of scale in Cayman. And I say all of that to say that in the US, as an example, they're in year 13, I think, of their merger, and they're not quite finished yet. I think the UK is in year 9 or 10. We don't expect that it'll take us that long, but of course, it is subject to available funding as well. So I hope that has answered the question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, through you, and I also want to thank the director for that response. I must say most of the other questions that I do have were answered by the previous witnesses, Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Nixon. And then the other questions that I do have, I will not get into those questions for the public forum, because at the end of the day, the CBC is also an enforcement division, and I'm not too quick to point out any weaknesses or deficiencies that may be inside their capabilities. But what I want to state for the record, and I think this is something that many members in this House have already stated, is our confidence in the director and the team that he has assembled to manage a customs function. And I must say that we're very pleased thus far. And the one last question I would just like to touch on is pretty much, we understand that the CBC is now going through a modernization process where they're trying to be more intelligence driven. And the question is, in terms of how is the progress of that being made and how is that coming along?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The answer to that question is that it is also a work in progress, because this is not something that we can achieve overnight. Again, to put it in perspective and in context, the Customs Department has been traditionally focused on revenue collection for a really long period of time. And we have we had and we still have a relatively small pool of officers who are trained and equipped to deal with the border control aspect of things within customs. So there is a huge learning curve for a large portion of the staff to go through that process to get to the point where we can have the meaningful implementation of our rotations policy. And what I mean by that is there's little point, Mr. Chairman, in me taking an officer who has been focused for the last 20 years, as an example, solely on revenue collection, and put that person in an investigative branch and expect them to function effectively. That wouldn't be fair to them. I shouldn't expect that of them. I am required then to ensure that they have the required training to enable them to carry out that function. So these are some legacy issues that I inherited, but I have to say that the officers are very, very willing to make the transition, those that have not been involved in both aspects of our operation. Mr. Chairman, I am somewhat reluctant to get into more detail in relation to the sort of transition to an intelligence-led operation, only to say that it is the way to go. The traditional gatekeeper's approach is an outdated methodology, and it is not as effective as you would expect it to be, because when you put an officer on the front line and you ask them to process every single officer in the exact same way, after the first 20, 25 minutes, they'll lose focus and they'll lose their effectiveness. That's just human nature. That would happen in any country. And so all the countries that's made the transition to an intelligence-led risk management organization has seen an increase in their detection rates and in their effectiveness. And we expect that the same will happen here. So, you know, if we know, as an example, that the majority of passengers arriving on most aircraft, most vessels in Cayman, are not people that we need to focus on. The majority are not. They're not criminals. They're not smuggling contraband. There's a small percentage that's doing that. And we need to get better at identifying who those people are. And ultimately, where we intend to get to is that when that aircraft or that vessel arrives in Cayman, we already know who's on board of that aircraft or who we need to target on board of that aircraft or that vessel, and the others can go through what we call the green channel, the fast track. For those who we need to target, unfortunately, their processing won't be as quick as the others, but that's the nature of the job, and that is the way that we intend to transition the organization in the future.
Through you, Mr. Chair. How many airlines are working with you on the advance information?
How many airlines?
How many of them are all of them working with you, or just some?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The answer to that question is that some of them are at the moment. The law is not yet in effect. I think it's about to come into effect shortly. I believe it's either later this month or next month. I don't remember precisely, so forgive me for that. But the legal requirement is not yet in place, but the majority of airlines, they cooperate with us. But I want to make a distinction, Mr. Chairman. There is a difference between providing a manifest and providing advanced passenger information. Advanced passenger information involves a lot more detail than a manifest. And for national security reasons, I don't want to get into the detail of that. But we've had an indication from all airlines that when we've spoken to all of them, that they're on board, they're ready for the implementation date, and we don't expect that we're going to have any issues. It works to a large extent already on a voluntary basis for outgoing. So you would have noticed that a couple of years ago, immigration controls were removed. The outgoing immigration controls were removed. And there's a similar system operating that allowed that to happen.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. What kind of assurance can you give us that the high-risk areas are sufficiently resourced, including appropriate staffing and fully functioning equipment, and assurance that the X-ray scanner in the CPIU is fully operational?
Mr. Chairman, I have redeployed staff to the high-risk areas within CBC. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we don't need more resources. As we make this transition to an intelligence-led organization, you will see operations change. So in a similar way that you have the experience that you have going through the Miami International Airport, where you see very few Customs and Border Protection officers in the U.S. You see very few of them on the front line, and the reason for that is that the majority of the work is being done behind the scenes. So to my earlier point, they know who they need to target before the aircraft arrives. We want to get to that point too, which would mean a further redeployment of staff once we have everybody trained up to the required level. But we don't have enough resources in some areas. We have, as an example, a need for more resources at our seaport. We process cruise passengers quite differently, like all countries, than we do with air arrivals. But if you look at the number of cruise arrivals, we do need to have a greater focus in that area. And we have requested resources in the upcoming budget for that, and also for post-auditing functions, because that's a critical area for us. And we've requested more resources for the airport and a number of other areas. So it remains to be seen what we will receive in terms of additional resources, but we have put requests in for additional resources. In relation to Mr. Bush's question relative to the X-ray machine, as the report indicates, it was down for a substantial period of time. It was on and offline intermittently. The truth of the matter is, Mr. Chairman, that piece of equipment, we're trying to, it should be back online again shortly, but the truth is it's on life support. It has passed the end of its useful life, and we are looking now to replace it. The question is whether we should replace it with another mobile unit or a stationary unit. So that's a policy decision that we haven't decided yet.
Mr. Chairman, through you, I think in your answer, sir, you gave me what I was looking for, and that you've requested what you needed in the upcoming budget. Thank you very much, and good luck.
You're very welcome, sir.
No, Mr. Chairman, I don't have any more questions, but I just want to thank.
I want to get back to the actual budgeting, because we have consistently seen where Customs has under budgeted, well, the revenue, that actual revenue collect every year seems to be substantially greater than what you budget. And I think the risk you're running in that, if we can't more accurately budget when you ask for your resources, because when you get to the Minister of Finance, they're looking at revenue and expenditure, right? And I'm wondering if there's any changes being made at your department level for the 2021 budget to get closer. I think last year you budgeted 156 and you collected 181 million. That's quite a divergent, because that 20 million there could probably have resourced you very well for the first 9 months of this year. So what changes have been made, or are there any changes under consideration to improve the accuracy of your budget?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think that there's always been a level of consultation between the department and the Minister of Finance and the Economics and Statistics Office. I think part of our issue, though, is that we haven't properly documented those consultations, and sometimes they're informal. As a long-serving former civil servant once said, Mr. Hara McCoy, that is, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen.
Right.
So we understand that, and but we continue to consult with those agencies, Mr. Chairman. You know, we look at economic forecast and we look at historical information in the budget in terms of the amount of revenue that we collected in the previous year or are projected to collect. And we try to make a best guesstimate based on that. We have not deliberately under-budgeted in terms of revenue forecast. We do the best we can with the information we can. I think it's a positive thing that we've exceeded our targets, but I understand your point, right, that what it does is you may...
You have avoided scrutiny of your revenue collection, because once you exceed it, people giving you a green light. But when you consistently do it, I think you need to have some consideration, because when we look at the numbers now, we see that what you budgeted last year was the same or less than you collected 2-3 years ago, right? So we would expect that the budget for 20 would be closer to 190, given that the government is projecting all this growth, right? Because I think it would add to your credibility if once in a while you fell short.
Mr. Chairman, I think I appreciate your point, but I'm sure there are others that would disagree with you. Mr. Chairman, I certainly take your point, and we're trying to improve as we go along to make changes so that the figure is more accurate. We know, as an example, that tourism is on the increase, so that's one of the factors we need to consider and look at the projections going forward. But we will continue to refine the numbers and try our best with that.
Yeah. If not, Mr. Clifford, thank you very much for...
Sorry, I just want to make a statement. Okay. I just want to thank the director and his team also. I think, with the transition and everything that has been going on, they have been doing a good job in terms of coping. They have maintained a very high confidence, both in the public and even with the membership in the House on both sides. And my last question is pretty much, is there anything that you think that we can do as legislators that could make your job, your function, or your unit more efficient, more effective, or just serve the public better?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The answer to that is that if you would support our request for additional resources when you see it come forward, we would certainly appreciate that. And also, I'll just say that in terms of customer service, you know that we have kiosks set up in various locations within CBC, and the results of the customer service Happier.kiosk is very encouraging. They are consistently upwards of 80% in terms of customer satisfaction. So if there are no other questions, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to thank my staff who are here today with me, the Finance Manager, Mrs. Camille Beckford-Johnson, and Deputy Director Kevin Walton. But in addition to those two, I'd like to thank the entire staff of CBC, including the administrative staff, because it takes every member of staff to make it happen. And they're all committed, they're all motivated, and we continue to try our best to support them on a daily basis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And you could convey our gratitude for those who have worked so hard for the transition, and we look forward to continued success.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Meeting is adjourned until 2 o'clock.